This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. Guess who I am? Yes, that's right, Joe Hildebrand, and this is The Real Story. And this week, it's World War III. Again, sorry to break it to you, but what a way to go out. Yes, the war between Russia and Ukraine has escalated again. So is it the end of days? We're going to speak to our resident Ukraine expert to find out. Also, it's World War III inside the coalition. Again. So what is going on? We thought they'd kissed and made up after they'd broken up, but now it appears that even after they've made up, that someone has to break up. Otherwise, they're not going to make up. So we're going to get to the bottom of that. Plus, these ridiculously boring, finicky tax on unrealised capital gains and superannuation. If you're still awake, I'm going to try to explain what's going on there too. Don't go away. So first up this week, I want to talk about just what the proverbial is going on with the coalition. So we know that last time we spoke that David Littleproud, the leader of the National Party, had walked away from the Liberal Party because they couldn't meet any of his four key demands, even though they said they probably would meet his four key demands. But because they couldn't actually meet those policy demands because the Liberal Party didn't actually know what its own policy was in each of the areas that the Nats were demanding commitments on, the Nats decided to walk away. Except that they didn't really, and it turned out that all of this could have been and was resolved by basically a Zoom call 48 hours later when they talked about the same demands and they couldn't even really agree on what the demands were that they were fighting over, and maybe we'll get to that later on. And now the Liberal Party has agreed in principle to the demands of the National Party, even though the Liberal Party still doesn't really have any fixed policies in the areas that the Nats are demanding, like things like net zero or nuclear power or here's a really good one, divestiture powers for Chemist Warehouse. Yes, there's an argument over whether or not divestiture powers that the government has over supermarkets to break them up if they're abusing their market share should be applied to other big chain retailers like, Chemist Warehouse, Bunnings, whatever. Seriously, this is what the coalition is blowing itself up over. But not anymore, because they've kissed and made up. It turns out all these things that were such high-minded matters of principles, all these things that David Littleproud felt that, like Mel Gibson in Braveheart, were worth being hung, drawn and quartered for. Freedom! Turns out freedom was actually quite negotiable. And they negotiated it and everything's just fine now. So again, what was all that about? What was the point of it? Was it just to show, hey Ma, look what I can do when I drop a hand grenade down the front of my pants, huh? It's just bonkers stuff. So, they've supposedly kissed and made up, even though the talks are still kind of ongoing. But they can't even, they're now fighting over what it was they were actually fighting over. So there were these four sort of policy areas that the Nats were banging on about, which seemed to be pretty fluid in and of themselves. But one of the key things was whether or not the Nationals in the shadow cabinet, so on the front bench, in the core group of shadow ministers, whether they should be able to break shadow cabinet solidarity, which is a very sort of long-standing and important convention in which even though Liberal or National backbenchers can criticise or question or speak out against or have different views on the official coalition policy, within the cabinet, the leadership group, they thrash it out in cabinet. This is what we think about this. And then that is the position that all those members, from the leader to the treasurer, foreign affairs spokesperson, whatever, that is the message that they then sell to the public, that they take to the public. So you don't have ministers fighting with each other over what the actual policy of the coalition is. And the Nats had said that that this was one of the things that they wanted. So they think that the problem with all the division and disunity within the coalition can be solved by ensuring there can be more division and disunity within the coalition. So that seems to be the Nationals' core position. But wait, as Tim Shaw would say, there's more. And so, but they had said that, no, that's okay. The Libs weren't really worried about that. That wasn't the sticking point. Apparently the sticking point was all those divestiture laws about But the Libs have then said, no, actually that was a sticking point. That is very much a sticking point. We do not think that having shadow ministers, senior front benchers arguing with each other publicly about what the actual coalition policy is or should be. We don't think that's a very good idea. We don't think that's really conducive to, harmony and, winning. And so they can't even agree on what they disagree about. So, again, I'm trying to set this out as simply as possible so that you can get your head around it. But this is how scrambled the coalition egg is. So they are divided on whether or not they should be allowed to be divided. That is where we are right now. That is, and that again, that is not the divided position. This is not a Kafkaesque nightmare that you're having in listening to this. This is the actual state of play. And now the Libs are saying that after all of this, David Littleproud has to go. He has to be removed as Nationals leader. And that may be so. Except that's not really the Libs' decision. They don't get to decide that because it's a different party. In fact, they weren't even in your coalition for an exciting 48 hours last week. And now you've got Libs publicly, albeit anonymously, but publicly saying, oh no, that bloke's got to go. Littleproud's got a pretty tight grip on the party room, it would seem, even though he's massively embarrassed himself over the last week or so. Matt Canavan challenged David Littleproud for the leadership straight after the election, got nowhere. Barnaby Joyce took a long time to get to the leadership, even though he was the face of the Nats. A lot of the more, the Bunyip aristocracy, the landed gentry, the agrarian socialists, a lot of them, thought that Barnaby was a bit too much of a loose cannon and were uncomfortable with just how kind of roguish and maverick and, quite frankly, downright fun he was. And so they've struggled to get that traction in there. So the Nats have, they went with Barnaby for a while and it was a wild ride, but they basically seem to like people who are slow and steady and safe, which is something David Littleproud certainly was not last week. But the last thing they're ever going to do is what the Liberals tell them to. I wanted to talk about what is probably the biggest, most burning and also most boring issue in Australian politics right now, and that is whether or not unrealised gains should be taxed in your superannuation. So basically, the policy of the government is that anything you have over $3 million no longer gets taxed at a concessional rate. Now, the pre-existing position was that you would have to pay 15% on unrealised gains that you had in your super account over $3 million. So if you had $3,001 in your superannuation account and it goes up to $3,100,000, you have to pay $15,000 in tax because you just made $100,000, even though you haven't taken that $100,000 out of the bank or out of the stock market or whatever the hell it is, right? Now, that was put in place by the coalition. That was actually put in place by the coalition government. But that is at the concessional rate, which is half the normal rate. Now, the Labor government is saying that you shouldn't get a tax break for amounts over $3 million, which I kind of reckon is fair enough. and that it should be $30,000 like other capital gains. But these are unrealised gains. So people are worried, and I think that is also fair enough, that, farms, for example. So if you've got a farm that is part of your self-managed super fund or whatever, and it goes up in value, even though it's still just the same old farm and you're not going anywhere and you're working on it and you're living in it, you still have to find the money each year to pay for how much its value is going up by, even though you're not receiving any of that value until you pack up and leave and liquidate the joint or whatever. So I think there are sort of valid concerns there. Another concern that has been raised is that politicians' pension schemes won't be covered. And the reason why some people are saying the politicians won't be covered is because their pension scheme is what's called a defined benefit rather than an actual asset. So the tax applies to assets and not, some would say, defined benefits. Now, very senior people in the Labor Party tell me, people in the government say, this is just bollocks. This is just not true. This is, pollies will be covered. Nothing to worry about. But that doesn't matter, because in politics, perception is reality. I don't know how many times I've said it, and I don't know how many times politicians need to hear it. This is what a lot of people think, and I know friends of mine who think that, oh my God, the government's coming after, the family farm, or, money I don't even have yet. And so it's something that needs to be addressed. Even if you're doing something fake to address a fake problem, that has real consequences in politics. That could disarm the issue, make people feel better about it. Pretty zen, huh? Also pretty sensible. So, as promised, it's World War III again. Donald Trump has taken to Truth Social to say that, hey, Vladimir Putin used to be a great guy. We used to hang out. We used to talk. Now he seems a little bit off. I think there's something not quite right with the guy. Maybe he's a little bit, dare I say it, crazy. And Putin's guys have come back and said that Trump seems to be going through some emotional turmoil himself. So will this little sort of voyage through the inner wanderings of the human heart, will this result in a nuclear apocalypse? Well, to answer that question, we have our resident Ukraine expert on the show. Welcome back to The Real Story, Misha Zelinsky. How are you?
Good to be with you, Joe. Very uplifting.
That's right. I thought
I'm feeling really good about it. World War III.
That's right.
Where would you rather be?
Look, assuming that this actually makes it to air before the nuclear holocaust, you obviously are an expert in Ukraine. You spent a lot of time over there during the war reporting on it. You've studied this very deeply. You're also, everything, a Fulbright scholar. You've got an expert in international relations, all this stuff. What do you see going on here? Is there some kind of strategy to the latest kind of, smashing together of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in this sort of public clash at the same time as you have an escalation of the missile strikes from Russia against Ukraine, deep into Ukraine, into the capital, and possibly even missile strikes going further back the other way? Is it World War III?
Well, not yet.
Okay, that's good. That's positive.
But the clock is striking closer to midnight, as it were, Joe.
Yeah.
Look, it is troubling. The truth of the matter is there is a strategy going on. It's Vladimir Putin's strategy, and he's winning.
Yep.
Donald Trump's strategy, such as it is, he's not a strategist. He's a tactician.
Correct.
Thinks hour to hour.
Yep.
And he doesn't think things through deeply. It's hard. What day are we of Trump's presidency? 150? Feels like 150 million. I don't know.
Yeah.
But what we certainly know about Trump is that he promised to end this war in a day, and he hasn't, because it's complicated. And Vladimir Putin has not changed his objectives. So if you actually follow through what's happened so far, the Ukrainians have done everything asked of them. They've handed over minerals that demanded quite outrageously by the Trump administration. They've signed on to that agreement. They've agreed to 30-day ceasefires. Putin hasn't. Yep. They went to Turkey for peace talks. Zelensky turned up. Putin didn't. And all the while Trump has been blaming Ukraine for starting the war, quite unbelievably, saying that Vladimir Putin's a good guy, that we've got to solve this, we've got to get to peace. Putin has been escalating the military activity. So as we speak right now, they're bombarding Ukrainian cities, civilian areas. The strikes have been actually some of the most deadly since the war began.
Yeah, that's right.
So this doesn't sound like a regime ready for peace. It sounds like a regime that is taking advantage of the other side's weakness and stupidity strategically. And so we've cut off the Ukrainians from receiving the aid that they need. They're not getting the help they need on the battlefield, and every day Ukraine is losing territory to Russia as they're pushing forward. Now, very costly. Putin is losing up to 2,000 troops a day. So even a country the size of Russia can't sustain that. But Putin is trying to grab every bit of territory and advantage he can, while Trump is essentially losing the strategic and tactical battle.
So just to spell it out for people who might not have been following it that closely, there's the eastern region in Ukraine, which Putin wants as a kind of land bridge to Crimea, and there's a very large sort of Russian-speaking population there, and there's been a bit of to and fro about, should that maybe be a part of Russia? What's changed recently is that there's been a record level of bombardment deep into Ukraine, further west to the capital, Kiev. This is in despite, as you say, of a supposed ceasefire that was meant to be in place.
Well, there's never been a ceasefire, but what the Russians have done while the Ukrainians have tried to get to peace and everyone has been encouraging peace talks is increase the level of military activity. So they've never stopped bombing civilian areas.
Now they're doing it more than ever.
They're doing it worse than ever, right? So there is no prospect of peace as it currently stands because his objectives have been very clear from the outset. And if you look at what the Russians are saying in their communiques about peace, they're saying we still need to get rid of the root causes. Now, this is kind of Orwellian speak. The root cause of the conflict was Ukraine wanted to be independent. So Ukraine would like to be independent, democratic, Western-leading European nation, and Vladimir Putin says no. And so his no to that was, in the end, partially he annexed Crimea in 2014. He started a civil war, effectively an invasion by another name in 2014, and then a full-scale invasion in 2022. Why? Because Ukraine wants to dare to be independent. And so that is the, inverted commas, root causes of this conflict. And until Ukraine capitulates and the world capitulates, Putin's never going to be happy. So how you can have peace in that circumstance is very difficult to imagine.
We could even say that the root cause is, in the 9th century when the Vikings founded Kiev and Rus, and Russia's
before Moscow, would you believe?
But that's right. And Russia's narrative is that, the Russian state actually began in Kiev in, the 9th century, and this is why we have to take it back. So they feel like this is, their toy that someone else stole from them. And so fast forwarding to Trump. Trump is obviously, in as far as there has been a strategy or a tactic, Trump seems to be engaging in this kind of madman diplomacy. It's like, you better do this or else, and I'm so crazy, I might actually do it. And it seems that Putin has just kind of called his bluff.
Were you familiar with taco theory?
Tell me.
Which is Trump always chickens out.
Oh.
And so this is actually a thematic that's come up in the markets, talking about tariffs. Whenever Trump says he's going to do some crazy thing economically, the markets tend to keep going up. Why? Because in the end, Trump chickens out. If you look at his tariff approach, in the end, when D-Day approaches, he extends it. He says, we've got a deal when there's really not a deal. He likes to announce deals even if they're, frankly, bullshit. He likes just the concept of deals more than actual deals.
Talking about deals.
Right? And so the markets have worked this out, and they go, you know what, he's actually not going to do anything. For all the talk, nothing's actually going to change. And it's the same thing on the battlefield and diplomatically. For all of Trump's huffing and puffing, if you go back to his first presidency, you might remember he was into this tough talk with the North Koreans. He's calling him Kim Jong-un, little rocket man, that there'll be fire and fury, I'll do all these things. Next thing, he's in North Korea holding hands, literally holding hands with Kim Jong-un and saying what a great man he is, and they exchange love letters. And so in the end, these dictators have worked out that, you know what, just keep pushing, keep taking what you want. Trump is actually a coward. He fears conflict. He actually fears war. He's a draft dodger. He is not a tough guy. He's actually quite sort of for all his tough talk, he's cowardly in most of the things that he does. He likes to pick the right fights, i.e. where he's by far the dominant player. Anything that's vaguely right-sized, he's scared of involving himself.
Which is a US trope generally anyway. I mean, the United States famously, only wins wars where it vastly outnumbers the opposition. But getting back to Trump, what does has Putin figured out that all you have to do with Trump is just pretend that there's a deal, wave a bit of paper in front of his face or say a few words, and as long as Trump thinks he can save face, that's enough for him? But that kind of hasn't happened now, has it? Because it's so obvious that Trump is being ignored. He's almost being belittled by Putin's people, saying, well, you're just emotionally unstable.
Trump clearly is getting frustrated because it's looking bad for him. And he cares about optics more than he cares about anything else. And he cares about being a great deal maker. So he's not getting this deal. The Russians are effectively ignoring him, taking what they can. Now, whether or not they can't probably, given the rate of progress in the battlefield, it's very unlikely they're going to be able to capture all of Ukraine. But they're trying to get as much as they can till at some stage, perhaps the pressure gets ramped up. Maybe the Americans finally get it together and start forcing more sanctions onto the Russians.
Well,
There's a
Trump's
big call
talked
now.
about that. I mean,
well, he has.
Surely that's the least that could happen, isn't it?
Well, I think that what's different about Trump talking about tariffs is actually now seeing it coming out of the congressional Republicans.
Yep.
So the congressional Republicans are now splitting with Trump and saying we've got to do something about what the Russians are doing. They're actually starting to find the traditional Republican voice very peculiar that they've become so Putin friendly as a party, but now they're starting to say, hang on a second, this guy's embarrassing us.
Maybe we backed the wrong horse.
Actually turns out that he is an evil guy who loves Joseph Stalin. I don't know if you saw this recently, but to get a sense of who the Russians are and who Vladimir Putin is, they've just put back a massive statue of Joseph Stalin into one of the Moscow metro stations, which was put in there in the 50s, was removed in the 60s, and is now back in modern-day Russia. This is
this is Putin's great hero. I mean, this is no secret.
This would be like the Germans putting a statue of Hitler in a Munich train station. It is madness. And this is who they are. They don't hide it. Like I always say, you don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to. Well, you should listen to Joe Hildebrand. He's very important. The real story, Joe Hildebrand. Make sure you tune in everywhere. But listen to what they are telling you.
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin is telling us all the time that the greatest geostrategic defeat and the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was not World War I, not World War II, not the Spanish flu, not every other tragedy. Right. It was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right. Yep. And this is how he sees the world, and he wants to reestablish it, and he's trying every day to do that. And the longer we ignore that, the more we're playing into his hands.
And I love it when you bring up the big historical stuff. Because first, fun fact, by the way, there are no statues of Hitler. The one thing Hitler, Stalin obviously loved to build giant monuments to himself and inspired Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984. But Hitler realised that statues, he didn't like that kind of iconography.
Interesting.
For whatever reason. Yeah. And also, Stalin was much, much crueler to his people around him. Yeah. So Stalin was always purging people.
Well, indeed, right?
Paranoid.
He killed millions of Russians.
And then killed and 3 million Ukrainians in the Great Famine of
Right.
Well,
so the brutalising person on his own people. And this is again,
Putin's
hero. But that's how he sees his own people. He's throwing literally thousands of men's lives away daily in attacking, parts of eastern Ukraine.
Exactly. And as you say, this is exactly what Stalin did during Stalingrad.
Right.
He just threw more and more Russians into the meat grinder. And the Germans just kept killing them. It's like one of those shitty little games that you see on your phone where you're just mowing down.
Ads.
Those ads that you
get. And there's a relentless sea of this.
And that's what Stalin was doing. And he would just reach further and further back into Siberia or wherever it was in any of the client states of the Soviet Union. And he would just shove them in there, basically till the Germans kind of ran out of bullets.
Famously, in the Battle of Stalingrad, they gave one person the gun and the other person the ammo and told you to get the boots off the people that were already dead.
Yep, that's right. And also had the KGB behind the lines,
if you
shooting anybody who turned around. And so the Russians were shooting their own people as well.
Show me the incentive, I'll show you the behaviour, as they say. So,
that's exactly
the
right.
incentive was pretty clear.
And again, this is Putin's model for war.
No, it is. And it's literally what they're replicating right now. That's the extraordinary thing about the conflict. I always say that there's two things going on. It's extraordinarily high-tech. You've seen the use of drone warfare. It's changed the battlefield extraordinarily. We'll be studying what's happened in this conflict for a long time in terms of the use of technology, but it's also unbelievably low tech. It is like World War I style trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat, men literally having to kill one another at close range, and it's awful stuff. And the scale of the death, 2,000 a day, close to 1 million Russians, maybe 500,000 Ukrainians. In a couple of years. We haven't seen warfare like that since World War II. It's extraordinary, the attrition on both nations. And it's all because of one man's psychotic vanity and the inability of other nations to stand up to it.
So on top of that kind of, that grind, like you say, that just war of attrition, that meat grinder kind of, hand-to-hand, street-to-street combat in the east of the country, you've got these missiles flying into Kiev in record numbers. Not the first time the capital's been hit, but it's being hit more than ever.
No, it's on fire every night.
Which is, horrendous, devastating scene. So, again, Russia is escalating at a time when...
And that's to terrorise the population.
That's right.
It's not to have a sense that there's going to be a military objective. Exactly. It is to terrorise Ukrainians, that we can strike you in your beds at night, women and children being killed every night. horrific drone strikes. Now, I've been there and I've heard these drone strikes as they come in. It's this screaming sound before an explosion. It's really awful and chilling. And the whole idea is to, give you sleepless nights, to rattle your confidence, to give you a sense that you can't win and that in the end that you're going to submit to Russia's terror. And so that is what the Russians are doing every day to the Ukrainians. Now, all they're asking from us is for weapons. They're not saying come fight with us. They'll say, we'll do the fighting, we'll do the dying. Please allow us to be able to do that. Give us the weapons that we need to do that, to hold the Russians at bay and to drive them back. And currently, as it stands, we are depriving the Ukrainians of the things they need to fight for their own freedom. It's really a shocking abrogation of what we should be doing. And it's never going to be cheaper than it is now. In the end, we're going to have to resist Putin's aggression at some stage. The question becomes how big a scale that is. Throughout the last 20 years, Putin's behaviour has gotten worse and worse and worse. Bad behaviour has become worse behaviour because we've never punished it.
Yep.
And if we let Putin get away with this, it won't just be a lesson that it's a green light for him and his objectives of rebuilding the Soviet Union. It'll be a green light to every other dictator around the world. So what is the lesson of World War II? It was not resisting bad behaviour before it became worse behaviour, before it became a global conflict, right? And World War II didn't just start, World War II commenced. It was 3 regional conflicts. It was the Italians invading Ethiopia.
Yep.
It was the Japanese invading China. It was, of course, the aggression of the Germans into Czechoslovakia and eventually into Poland, all turning into one conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're seeing a similar thing now emerging. You've got the Russians obviously invading Ukraine. You've got the North Koreans fighting alongside Russians in Europe right now. Madness. And you've got the aggression of the Chinese all through East Asia, all through the South Pacific, circumnavigating Australia.
That's right.
And you've got
it's all
Iran.
Strangely familiar,
Right,
isn't
and
it?
you've got Iran.
Which is a Russian ally.
Indeed, destabilizing the Middle East and helping terrorist organizations like the Houthis and others. So it is a similar footprint. Nothing's the same, and we shouldn't overlearn the lessons of history. But I can tell you one thing, bad behavior unpunished becomes worse behavior. Putin and others are watching what we'll do next.
Exactly. And you look at Crimea and think, if we just give him Crimea, maybe he'll be happy and go away.
Czechoslovakia to Hitler did not stop that there either.
That's right.
There's always another ask, and eventually a red line is crossed.
It's like the old Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, we'll just pay off the barbarians and they'll go away.
Indeed.
So finally, one of the breakthroughs, or whatever you might want to call it, has been that the Germans are now saying that they're going to lift the restrictions on the range of the missiles that they're giving the Ukrainians. So basically, it used to be that they just had sort of shorter range missiles so they could fight sort of on their turf, on their frontiers. Now they're going to give them the big boys that can go right into Russia.
Yeah.
How do you see this playing out? Is this going to provoke that, global conflict?
Provoke the Russians into doing what? Worse?
Even more, that's right.
The thing is, again, right, what the Russians do is play bluff poker. They hope to rattle you into doing nothing. So they say, well, you wouldn't want this to get any worse. Well, worse than murdering, raping and torturing people in eastern Ukraine. It's hard to imagine much worse behaviour. Now, clearly we don't want World War III to break out, but wishing it away is not going to stop it. So we've got bad choices and worse choices. The bad choices is resisting Putin. The worst choice is letting him win. I think the purpose of allowing the Ukrainians to strike into Russia is not going to allow the Ukrainians to conquer the Russians.
Is it psychological?
Well, what it does is it shows the Russians that this is not a consequence-free war. That, why did Churchill bomb Berlin in 1940, even though there was no prospect of the British reclaiming European territory? It's to show the Germans that you can't sit comfortably at home while we here are attacked by you without consequence. And to show the Russians that there will be consequences for your actions. What Putin has tried to do is to say...
Churchill, I think, called it terror. He said, we want them to be afraid. We want them to be terrified.
And so the Russians need to feel as unsafe as the Ukrainians do, and to say that this is not some war you can ignore. You can't just continue to do your shopping in St. Petersburg and Moscow while other people are dying west of you in Ukraine, that this is a war that you yourselves are responsible for. It's not just Vladimir Putin, that your government is doing this in your name, and that the consequences are being brought home to them as well. So that was why Ukraine sought to invade parts of Russia, which they control for a period they no longer do. And that's why they're starting to attack military targets, and just to basically bring consequence onto the Russians themselves. Now, there's other things we can do. We can up sanctions. We can cut off Russia's supply chains around the world, particularly the support they're getting from the Chinese, and we can cut them off financially to stop them selling oil and gas to other parts of the world. we can do a lot to them. Russia's economy is extraordinarily weak.
Yep.
They're running fast out of the supplies they need in terms of chips, but they're circumnavigating a lot of the sanctions, and we're turning a blind eye.
So, presumably, let's take at face value Donald Trump's psychological assessment of Vladimir Putin, that he is crazy, he's lost his mind, he's a man on a mission. Nothing's going to dissuade him from this. Presumably, if it was going to, it would have done so by now. Is the purpose of any sort of escalation into or further reaching into Russian territory, like we've discussed, is that to get the leaders around Putin rattled enough or thinking that the cost is escalating too much to bear so that they topple him? Can he be removed internally? I mean,
Look, it's certainly possible. You never know. The thing about regimes like Putin's Russia is that they appear strong, but they're very brutal.
Until they're not. Yeah.
And look, don't forget, Putin survived a near coup with Prigozhin in middle of 2023.
Haven't seen that guy for a while.
Well, indeed, he fell out of a plane. But it shows you that these things are febrile, and you put a nation and a regime under enough pressure, something might go pop, right? That's the theory. Russia is a nation enormously under pressure. It's effectively turned into one big panic room by Vladimir Putin.
That's right.
They're cut off from the world. But at the moment, a little bit of the pressure is starting to come out because the sanctions are being evaded. The consequences aren't as high. But look, they're losing 2,000 men a day. Putin can lie all he wants, but the body bags are piling up, and people see the brutal consequences on their own society of that conflict. And look, if you see the polling, and polling Russia is challenging, but
obviously,
like, it's surprisingly, the support for the war is not as high as you might think. And so, look, the choice we have is not great, but the choices we have are increasing sanctions on the Russians to build that pressure we talked about, and arming the Ukrainians. Pretty easy things for us to do. It doesn't require us to spill a drop of blood. It's just a tiny little bit of our, caches of weapons and a little bit of, minimizing of trade and increasing of prices around the world. Very, very easy to shelter ourselves from. What's the price of avoiding World War III? Doesn't sound that high to me. But the price of avoiding it later will get higher and higher and higher, unfortunately.
Misha Zelinsky, very wise man, Ukrainian expert, Fulbright scholar, senior Labour insider, footy numbers man, like just everything, world president. I think if you were in charge, if you were commander in chief of planet Earth, what a peaceful,
there'd be a lot more
freedom-loving place it would be with lots more rugby league. Thanks so much for joining us,
Good to be with you, mate. Thanks.
And that is all we have time for this week. If on the off chance World War III hasn't broken out, I will see you next week. In the meantime, you can get in touch with us at The Real Story at novapodcast.com.au. You can hit me up on Instagram, which is the only social media platform worthy of my beautiful face. I'm at Joe_Hildebrand. You can also leave us a rating or review or any of the podcast things that young people do these days when they're not out terrorising folks with their skateboards and whatnot. And, of course, you can read everything else I've got to say in all the News Corp mastheads every Monday and Saturday. Till then, farewell.